discuss this, I have the former Conservative Junior Minister for International Development and, more recently, UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief, Stephen O'Brien. Good evening to you, Stephen.
Good evening.
And also joined by Sophia Gaston, who's the Director of the British Foreign Policy Group. Hello, Sophia.
Hello.
Can I just ask you both this? The Office of the Prime Minister, number 10 Downing Street, is saying today that there is no surplus capacity. We do not have the spare vaccines to send to India. But clearly that depends on the priorities attached by the government to the supplies that are available. Sophia, your view on whether we have spare capacity and that we're able to help India to a greater extent than we are able to do now?
I think it's a really tough one. I mean, I think it's totally understandable for national governments, particularly ones like ours that have been under a huge amount of pressure. You know, the coronavirus pandemic is really a test of governance, and we had a pretty tough 2020, and the vaccine is absolutely integral to us. You know, I think not only moving on kind of economically, but also socially. And I think everyone's aware that the lockdowns that have been necessary because of the pandemic have had huge social costs. So I'm not surprised at all that national governments feel that they need to vaccinate their own populations first.
Yes.
But I do think that the calculation is shifting a little bit, especially now the vast majority of our most vulnerable populations have been vaccinated. When you look across at one of our most important strategic allies like India going through a real humanitarian crisis, I think it becomes a little bit more difficult to make that calculation. But yeah. I still understand why in number 10, I mean, I think they're correct in saying we don't really have any spare capacity. One of the biggest challenges with the pandemic is the fact that I think we really all thought that in some way the vaccine production and distribution process was going to go in a kind of linear way. It would increase exponentially, but we've just had roadblock after roadblock. And so I think everyone's been thrown a little bit off kimber, and I'm not surprised the governments are feeling a little bit uncertain about their own path.
I guess in one sense it is not surprising that a national government should say we have to look to our own population, our own voting population first. Stephen O'Brien, what are your thoughts?
Well, having had a number of roles, both in the democratic system as an MP and then responsibility to actually make sure stuff happens across the world according to need, my first thought is, of course, we have to chase wherever the greatest needs are. That's been the case with all global health approaches, whether it's the transmission area of sub-Saharan Africa for malaria or now for those countries who are suffering most from COVID. And whether you're talking about India, which is going through the most appalling spike, and it's very much something which we are all concerned about. We all feel very for both the Indian people, individuals and communities, as well as what the pressures faced by the Indian government. But I do think that there is a marked balance to be struck here, particularly in democracies, and particularly as it happens, the US and the UK, both of whom are already supplying what they can to India very rapidly, in notable contradistinction to quite a number of other countries who are also so-called first world countries, with both money and some development on both vaccines and on some oxygen kits in particular, PPE masks, whatever. But the real issue here is, the spare capacity point has just been made very well by Sophia, is that having now vaccinated pretty well our most vulnerable population, subject to the emergence of variants, then, of course, the balance has to be struck, which is not just a scientific one. There does end up being a certain amount of moral and values-based judgment to be made here as to whether we should be transferring into the COVAX system. So it's coordinated. It's absolutely vital. And I would support Tedros at the World Health Organization in the call for trying to distribute as fast as possible through the COVAX system, so you can actually get the supplies to meet the greatest need, where the greatest vulnerability and the greatest propensity is for the most severe consequences of catching COVID. It is in our interest because, apart from the easy statement that we're only safe when everybody is safe, it's actually to do with when you have great intensity, such as you have in India, then you have a greater likelihood that the variants will develop and develop very fast. We know that in these pathogens, the speed with which they can develop resistance to things such as the current development of vaccines is so rapid that we don't want to be overtaken by ignoring the scale and intensity of the ability for these
Yes.
pathogens to replicate themselves in a way which can bypass the vaccines as we know them. So
And I do want to
that's
come.
the balance we strike.
I do want to come to the question of mutations in the virus and variants of the virus. But before we go there, Sophia, you made the point that you think the balance of the argument may be beginning to shift. Here in the UK, we have vaccinated the most vulnerable in our society. We're getting to the point where people, mathematically, at very considerably less risk of catching the virus, certainly much less risk of falling seriously ill or dying. Well, they've been covered. Would it not be easier now to sell the humanitarian case for a greater response to the Indian emergency, Sophia?
Well, look, I think it's very difficult to begrudge any citizens that the right to access the vaccine. And I think often in our discourse, we're sort of, there's this idea that young people are just sort of raring to go and free themselves of the shackle of lockdown. But, certainly younger people that I know, a lot of them are still dealing with huge amounts of anxiety and concern about their and people around them's personal well-being. And so I think it's absolutely right that we must ensure that everybody is vaccinated. I think this is a question of timing. And this is where something like, a much more coordinated approach in the West, which is absolutely not what we've seen at every turn in this pandemic. In fact, every opportunity we've had to kind of prove the value and longevity of and endurance of the Western alliance, who seem to have just turned inwards. But if you think about burden sharing, that kind of NATO term, if we think about it in terms of vaccines, I mean, obviously there's the COVAX scheme itself, but when you've got a crisis like India, that's something where if you have a critical mass of enough kind of like-minded allies coming together, if everyone just gives a little bit together, you've got a much more powerful aid package. And so I think that's where you can start to say, well, if you're looking at delaying perhaps vaccinating some of the younger, less vulnerable population by a month or so, if everyone puts in a little bit, then you can make a big difference. And I think that's been one of the biggest problems with this pandemic, that the instincts have constantly leaned inwards.
And Stephen, Sophia makes the point that it's a matter of timing, but do we have as much time as we need, as we would like? On the scientific question, there is a very real worry that as the disease tears around the Indian population, every time there's a count, it's 300,000 more cases, there is more and more chance of the virus mutating, and then mutating again, double mutants, triple mutants, which then could pose a risk to those even double vaccinated in a country like the UK. So the answer is either do more to help or to shut borders to a country like India indefinitely. And that's not an acceptable choice, is it, Stephen, or is it?
Well, these are incredibly difficult questions. And, even though I've been in politics, I've been a minister, I don't envy for 1 second the Prime Minister and those currently having to make these extremely difficult decisions between the chance of people surviving and the freedom that we would expect under the rule of law in a democratic system. I mean, incredibly tough choices. But I think we've got to be very careful here. There is also the question of this has all got to be paid for. And all these vaccines have been developed in the private sector, so there has to be some form of recognition of where's the money coming from. Often these companies are not making margin at all on these supplies, but they are getting them done and they're out, and so they do need to be paid for. That is in itself something of accountability, which has to refer back to those who can afford. But the thing I'm most worried about is that if we don't put some restriction on the borders until there is a much more effective distribution under the COVAX system, as I would certainly support and argue, then I think that there is this real risk that we could find these mutations, however multiplied, could overtake us before we have the answers to them. And we do know from the very successful distribution of vaccines, particularly to the most vulnerable here in the UK, that this is the best answer out of the crisis. And, we've been trying to do this for years in sub-Saharan Africa on malaria. And yes, with all sorts of clever techniques and continuing huge amounts of money for research, we brought the death toll down from 1 million to about 480,000 per annum. But we've still got a long way to go. And we've spent decades trying to get a vaccine against a parasite-borne disease, with the mosquito, and have not yet succeeded. So These are incredibly long-term things, and yet we've within a year got to the stage where we have got answers. So the prize is not to let anywhere in the world get ahead of our ability for vaccines to be the answer. And so I think this balance, which I think Sophia put it very well, I would suggest that we need to be as generous as we can, but not to put ourselves into a position of vulnerability. It is better to act from a position of strength, which unquestionably the UK has now got for itself. And I think that for all the brickbats flying around, I think the government should be congratulated. I didn't just say that as a former Conservative MP. I just think that it has been a successful rollout of the vaccine programme. And I think we need to guard and make sure we hold that, but at the same time, recognise that as we already are, and as a leader, we are contributing to the COVAX system. And it's the coordination of that which is so important. And the other point that I think is fair to make, but a very difficult one to make, because it attacks the sort of moral equivalence issues which are lying behind all this. But there is an issue as to the price that India is paying for there to be a massive reluctance at a leadership level to impose a lockdown. And the question is clearly the population of India now are suffering terribly and paying a price for that political choice.
Yeah.
The question is, how much have we got to step in to try and overcome the consequences of that choice?
Yeah.
And I think that, in a sense, I don't think we have a choice. I think we've got to try and make the best of it. But that said, there is a fair question to be asked as to whether it's our responsibility or whether the Indian government needs to step up in a more constructive way, both imposing lockdown, putting restrictions on travel, and finding the money. I know that it's got a very straightened exchequer, but nonetheless, India does have money. Very much of the argument that I used to have to face about giving aid to anywhere in India was because they had their own space program. Well, I'm afraid maybe they've got to stop the space program in order to fund some COVID.
Yeah, but some of our listeners have texted in with precisely that point. I think you put the argument very fairly, Stephen O'Brien, and clearly the leadership of India has not done the country any particular favour. Narendra Modi, the Hindu nationalist leader, until recently encouraging mass political rallies despite evidence that they were acting as a super spreader of the virus. All sorts of really quite difficult dilemma involved in addressing this question. But Stephen O'Brien, thank you for joining us, former UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, and thanks to Sophia Gaston, Director of the British Foreign Policy Group. Coming up in the next